Chapter 40, Angel of Death. December 21st, 2086. Ocean of Storms, Earth's Moon. David Sepulveda had not gotten much sleep. Currently, he was still aboard the Singaporean destroyer Vengeance. The ship itself was sitting on the surface of the moon, about 384,000 kilometers from Earth. It was not safe to return. The Galactic Defense Force was everywhere, having seized full control of the Sol system. At any moment, the Vengeance might be found. For weeks, he and Scarlett Freeman had gone back and forth in a series of arguments. Each encounter typically ended in a shouting match that produced no results. Every day, the topic remained the same: fight or flight. Thanks to the Hyperwave Relay Network, Scarlett, David, and the crew of the Vengeance all knew about the events of the recent weeks. Everyone knew that Pascal Etienne's administration had not survived the Battle of Alpha Centauri, and that Blake Robinson was taking over. David told Scarlett plainly that the war was lost, and that she needed to consider fleeing at once. "We need to go to the Ulysses rally point," David had said. "We'll get to Deneb, lie low, and wait for Marshal Beauclair to catch up with us. There's no point going to Earth. We'd be wasting our time going back. Plus, there's nowhere to go. All of our safe houses are compromised." "We have to go to Canaveral," Scarlett replied. "Beauclair is going to need all of the help she can get to get all of our troops and assets safely away. Plus, Subject 3 is the only catalyst on the ground, and with Inez gone, I'm the only conduit. There's no point going to Deneb unless we can extract Subject 3. "No one is getting off Canaveral. No one's getting off Earth." David was exasperated by this point. "Did you see the Mahuika? Or the Ashoka? Or those weird robot aliens who came out of nowhere? Those vessels are heavy hitters. You might not get past them at all, and if you do, there's no way you could run the blockade a second time." Back and forth they went for a week while Vengeance hit on the moon. The captain and his staff occasionally jumped in as well, with a slim majority favoring an immediate escape to Deneb. But the stalemate endured. A few days later, David was lying on his bunk in Deck 2, watching a flotilla of GDF vessels out the window. He was trying to settle in for a nap and let his voice rest when there was a frantic pounding on the door. "Sepulveda, are you in there?" called a voice. "You need to see this." David reluctantly opened the door and found a UN Army soldier. She was an African woman with very short hair. A name tag identified her as Sergeant Rella from South Sudan. Before David could say anything, Sergeant Rella pushed a tablet computer into his face. "Look at this," Sergeant Rella said. It was a live hyperwave broadcast. David froze when he saw who was on the screen. It was Inez Espinosa. She looked even more beautiful than what he was used to, and his eyes locked onto the screen as Inez continued speaking. "She would have destroyed our future if left unchecked. Akira triggered the first hyperspace war thousands of years ago. She orchestrated the Levakian uprising, turned Kyle Bradshaw's gun against J.D. Robinson, and allowed monstrous tyrants like Irisha Kimoto, Emperor Raisteyu, and Makan to rise to power all over the galaxy," Inez said. "What is she talking about?" David said, talking over the broadcast. Sergeant Rella put her finger to her lips and pointed up at the ceiling. The bridge was just one floor above them. "Director Freeman," Sergeant Rella whispered. "She's the Paradox. She's Akira Robinson." David felt his breath catch in his chest. "Bullshit," he said. The sergeant pointed down at the tablet. "I am going to fight Akira Robinson, my own mother. I am ready to pay the same price as the 15 Stormbreakers to secure our freedom and our future against the one woman who wants those things for herself and no one else." Inez was finishing her speech. She did say something after this, but David never heard it. At that moment, the intercom crackled, and Scarlett Freeman's voice rang throughout the ship. "Central Officer Sepulveda, report to the bridge." David had about 5 seconds to process this massive revelation. Had he really been taking orders from the Paradox this whole time? When did Akira supplant Director Freeman? Those questions would have to wait. "Don't go!" Sergeant Rella grabbed David by the shoulder. "You know what the Paradox is like. What if she brainwashes you? Telepathy, you know?" "Can she brainwash us at all?" David wondered aloud. "I thought Jericho destroyed the gift." As soon as the words were out of his mouth, David knew he was wrong. He remembered, very vividly in fact, the many long nights at Banach Base when Scarlett would test out her personal Prometheus device. The contraption, worn as a backpack and gauntlet pair, would be able to function as a psionic amplifier. If even a small trace of Akira's powers were restored, then she could use the device to return to full strength. David rephrased his question. "What if we're already brainwashed? How long has Akira had us under her spell?" The two soldiers were paralyzed in fear. David could not find the willpower to defy Akira. No matter how many reservations he had, refusing her summons seemed to be out of the question. Akira was still speaking in the voice of Scarlett Freeman, using her name, rank, and authority, and David was beholden to those things. That was what he thought anyway. Sergeant Rella did not hesitate. She put both hands on David's shoulders and started to push. Awkwardly, the pair started to make their way down the corridor. "Wait, what are you doing?" David said, finding his voice. "Somebody has to save our skins," Sergeant Rella replied. "We've got to find a place to hide." "Hide where?" David said. "In case you haven't noticed, we're on the freaking moon. It's not like we can just joyride an escape pod to the next town over." Sergeant Rella looked around the corridor frantically, her eyes wide. "I don't care. I won't serve the Paradox. I won't," she said. Then Rella locked her eyes on a metal grate in the wall. It was covering an access hatch. Above it, a red and white warning sign pointed at the hatch with lettering that spelled out, "Danger! Active waste disposal." Sergeant Rella pulled out her laser pistol and used it to melt the locking mechanism. Then she pulled the grate open. "Into the garbage chute, flyboy," Rella said, and without waiting for an answer, Sergeant Rella pushed David into the crevice. As soon as the central officer was gone from view, Rella stepped inside and pulled the grate back into place over her. In seconds, the two fugitives vanished into the labyrinthine interior of the destroyer. December 23rd, 2086. Herds Deep, English Channel. In the dead of night, a heavily laden cargo ship sailed across the calm water. The ocean-going vessel was flying the flag of Brazil and traveling west, away from Europe and into the Atlantic Ocean. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, dense clouds blew in from the north and blocked the moon, casting the sea into darkness. The crew worked quickly. 2 heavy-lift cranes became active, one at the bow and one near the stern, just before the conning tower. Under the watchful eyes of the ship's captain and a UN observer, a large metal sarcophagus was lifted off the deck. The box-shaped structure was half the length of the supersized cargo ship and took nearly an hour to be lifted into the air by the twin cranes. While the sarcophagus hung suspended, the crew worked frantically, moving a series of ramps into position and welding them down. After about 2.5 hours of intense work, a large ramp now existed on the starboard side of the vessel. On the bridge, Sophie Murphy, granddaughter of Blake Robinson, watched in awe as the sarcophagus was lowered onto the ramp and released. With a terrible scraping noise, a shower of brilliant sparks, and a cascade of salt water, the metal tomb slid off the ship and into the sea. In moments, the third hyperspace core sank below the surface and vanished from view, descending into its watery grave 600 feet below. Sophie followed the instructions she was given by the ISO. She looked over the shoulder of the ship's navigator and wrote down the exact location coordinates. Once the hyperspace core was sunk, the cargo ship sailed out into the Atlantic Ocean before turning south, en route to Africa. Sophie spent the next 3 days in her cabin. She was carrying out the next part of her instructions. Sophie began committing the location coordinates to memory. She made up a quiz, tested herself, and recited the numbers forwards and backwards. On the third day, Sophie woke up and brushed her teeth. 49 degrees, 36 minutes, 15.83 seconds north, Sophie recited before spitting out her toothpaste. 3 degrees, 12 minutes, 1.39 seconds west. Over lunch, she recited the core's location quietly to herself. 49 degrees, 36 minutes, 15.83 seconds north. 3 degrees, 12 minutes, 1.39 seconds west. Finally, as the sun went down, Sophie watched as a submarine emerged from the waves and approached the cargo vessel. This military sub would take her off the ship and all the way to Cape Canaveral. Returning to her cabin, Sophie packed her gear and recited the location one last time. 49 degrees, 36 minutes, 15.83 seconds north. 3 degrees, 12 minutes, 1.39 seconds west. Taking a deep breath and feeling confident in her memory, Sophie picked up the piece of paper on which the coordinates were written. Then she shredded the paper into little strips, set the strips on fire, and threw the ashes into the sea. From now until the moment she returned to Cape Canaveral, Sophie Murphy would be the only person in the galaxy to know the exact location of the third hyperspace core. The 17-year-old activist spent the whole journey riddled with nervous anxiety, twisting her hair in her hands until she saw dry land once more. She was anxious about keeping such a massive secret, of course, but there was another thing. By doing this, Sophie was permanently aligning herself with Scarlett Freeman. Or rather, as Inez Espinosa had so dramatically revealed, the paradox. It's okay, Sophie told herself. I'm doing the right thing. Akira wants the same thing we do. She's on our side. December 24th, 2086. Bay Lake, Florida. The city of Orlando was abuzz with activity. Starships from the Galactic Defense Force were launching by the dozen, dropping off soldiers and taking off again. Most of the local population shut themselves away in their homes, but a few came out to greet the GDF. Small children waved colorful flags and stared at the many different species of alien who marched into their city. Earthborn aliens, left over from the Advent occupation, gave the GDF a warm reception. Vipers, mutons, and sectoids came out to meet the GDF and greeted them as liberators. A few troopers stopped to offer candy to youngsters. The busy nature of events in Orlando distracted from events taking place only a short distance away. About 20 miles to the west of Orlando, there was a series of ruined buildings, left untouched since the beginning of the Second Hyperspace War. The forces of nature had done their utmost to reclaim the land, breaking up concrete and crumbling walls. However, tonight was different. For the first time in over 70 years, The educational facility once known as Disney University was being used. A mixed force of American and GDF workers used advanced fabrication technology from the Tidan Republic to quickly restore the ruined complex to working order. Phased disassembler arrays broke down solid matter, trees and rubble alike, and then reconstituted it into construction materials. My core droids did most of the heavy lifting, while organic workers assembled the individual parts. Within 2 days, the former site of Disney University was partially restored. A grand building was erected, ready to serve as a venue for the most consequential of meetings. While the building and its interior were restored, all of the symbols of its former owner were painted over. The logo of a now defunct megacorporation was covered up and replaced by the insignia of 3 organizations: the United Nations, the Galactic Council, and the United States of America. Inside, a grand assembly was taking place. Dozens of meetings and conferences were taking place simultaneously, each room filled with sentient beings who argued and debated one of 2 topics: the end of the war and what happened afterward. In one room, representatives of the United Nations were attempting to formalize the end of hostilities with the galactic community, as they were ordered to do so by their new leader, Blake Robinson. Meanwhile, just down the hall, another group of UN dignitaries were following another of Blake's orders. This group of negotiators were hammering out a deal that would allow the United States of America to rejoin the UN, while simultaneously respecting Hawaii's newfound status as an independent state. And on the second floor, Inez Espinosa found herself in a large, grand room. Long tables and fancy chairs facilitated the high-level discussions between Secretary General Robinson and Galactic Custodian Marca. Both leaders were leaving the peace talks to their underlings. Today, Blake and Marca were focused on the planning of their final battle. They were not alone. The Wolverines, Stormbreakers, Shipbreaker Carfu, Crew Chief Magra, Arabic, General McCavity, the Dragon-like Advisor, Emmanuel Espinosa, General Osmer, Colonel Sharp, Marcus Robinson, Ruslan Shmial, Varuna Das, former Secretary General Pascal Etienne, and the Director of the Emerald Institute were all attending this planning session. Jericho was also present, but she stayed near Blake Robinson, almost as though she was hiding behind him. "What happened to Marshal Beauclair?" Custodian Marca asked. "She eluded the Polizei, and we've lost track of her," Secretary General Robinson replied. "Wherever she is, Commander Eberhardt from XCOM is with her. Same for Yasin Ackerman and Rafi Bakir. I'm working to have her apprehended now." "What do you mean by that?" Shipbreaker Carfu asked. "I've appointed an interim director of the Internal Security Office," Blake Robinson explained. "Alex Ettinger used to be a Secretary General a few decades back. He's a good decade younger than me, and he knows UN institutions inside and out. With him in charge of the ISO, we can disentangle the government from Akira's influence and shut out her allies." "Getting control of the ISO will not be instantaneous," General Osmer said. "Akira was its director for almost 8 years. It will take time for Mr. Ettinger to undo his predecessor's machinations and remove her lackeys from the equation. We must proceed as though the ISO is still a threat." Queen Marca nodded. "I realize that hostilities between our peoples are over, but I have to confess, I see an armed assault against Cape Canaveral as our only recourse. Those children have families who are waiting for them back home, and we cannot wait much longer." "Agreed," Secretary General Robinson replied. "We've already waited too long as far as I'm concerned." Inez waved her hand to get everyone's attention. "Cassandra told me that Polly Spark and her team stopped executing kids after the Battle of Amadio," Inez explained. "So the number I gave Lawrence and his crew back in October is probably still good," she said. Piggybacking off her words, Lawrence spoke up. On the high end, we think there are 215 children inside the Canaveral base. The low estimate is 180. My intelligence officer says there are 202 children, Queen Marka corrected him. At least 40 Partogans, 25 Higarans, 30 Skildari, a dozen Cybon, 7 Ozcox, and a collection of Celt, Ashurians, Vor, Blor, Tidani, Vanians, Vagar, Tobari, Amadi, Levakians, and at least 1 Mykor. Erebik ruffled her feathers in disgust. About a year ago, the progeny raided an Ozcox hatchery and made off with dozens of eggs. Enough time has passed for the viable ones to hatch. I urge caution. There could be Ozcox, Vanians, and Amadi who have spent their entire lives in captivity and will know nothing of the outside world. We must have specialized personnel ready to receive them. The dragon-like advisor answered her. A friend of ours has volunteered to help solve that problem, the advisor said. Our comrade from the Emerald Institute is willing to help. The director of the Emerald Institute straightened his necktie and gave the assembled group a grin. For sensitive crises such as this, the Institute maintains a highly trained Go team. This squad of specialists would have been right at home in your old XCOM project had they lived 7 decades ago, the Institute director said. The team only has 4 members, but one of them is a human and another is Cybon. They go by the names of Emma von Richthofen and Claws of Honeydew, respectively. I have full confidence in their training. The Institute and all of its members are prepared for any eventuality involving the paradox. That's all well and good, General McCavity cut in. But first, we must carry out an actual rescue. Espinosa and Robinson are right. The longer we delay, the greater the risk of these children being either murdered or spirited away to planets unknown. We must act. I agree with McCavity. Jericho spoke in a voice that was so soft nobody should have heard it. Somehow, everyone in the hall immediately took note of her and fell silent, giving Jericho their full attention. I know my friend Blake hates jumping into things without a plan, Jericho said, but we have to remember that our enemies will not be idle this whole time. The ISO forces inside Cape Canaveral are plotting their own escape right now. They will try to slip past us, and the longer we wait, the more opportunities we present for them to do just so. We've already waited too long, and any longer will spell disaster for us. Blake put a hand on Jericho's shoulder and nodded. She's right, Blake said. My friends, the formalities cannot wait, but we must be swift with them. What is the earliest we could mount an assault on Cape Canaveral? All of the American forces will be in place by December 27th, Colonel Sharp replied. We're just waiting on the last contingent of fighters to arrive. A large unit from northern Michigan is on the way. The Chippewas, Jay chimed in. Those are the guys who helped us take Alpena. We can't go without them. They're great at taking facilities like this. I will send a starship to pick them up and bring them the rest of the way, Blake said. Madam Custodian, what about your forces? The GDF will be ready for combat on December 28th, Marka said. This is something you cannot rush. There are tens of thousands of soldiers who must acclimate to the climate and gravity before being asked to fight. Kelta is a high-gravity world, Nainu said. My people will need time to adjust to the spring in our step here. Ashuria's atmosphere contains a high amount of sulfur, Kingi said. This world does not. My people will need to be issued respirators. Same for my people, Setla said. Mykonon's atmosphere has a great deal more carbon dioxide and methane than Earth. We will have to stay on our ships and deploy the droid army. The verdict was clear. With nearly 24 alien species counted among its ranks, the GDF would be useless for at least an additional week while its troops acclimated to Earth. This was the one true disadvantage of a multi-species military. The only members of the GDF who were ready to fight at this very moment were Partogans, Higarans, Tidani, Vor, and Mykor battle droids. All others were written off, at least for now. Somehow, the plan to assault Cape Canaveral would proceed. The next day, Inez was woken up in the early morning by her father. She and Cassandra were dressed in semi-formal outfits and spent the next 6 hours participating in some formal ceremonies. First and foremost, there was a signing ceremony in the former lecture hall of Disney University. Secretary General Blake Robinson and Galactic Custodian Marca signed a legal document that formally ended the war between Earth and the Galactic Council. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of dignitaries from the UN General Assembly and the Galactic Council, while soldiers from both sides stood guard around the hall, dressed in ceremonial uniforms. As soon as the signing ceremony ended, Cassandra looked around for familiar faces and spotted the Stormbreakers. She pointed and laughed. Quarter looks so silly! Inez looked around and followed Cassandra's finger. The Stormbreakers looked very out of place, standing among the GDF soldiers. Each member of the team was dressed in a formal outfit. Nainu and Maui looked immaculate in long-sleeved suits, while Setless scales could be seen pressing against the fabric of his clothes. Kingi scowled at everyone like always, seeming not to care about what people thought of his formal clothes. Then Inez saw Quarter. Not only was she stuffed uncomfortably into a woman's business suit, someone attempted to brush her fur, only to make her look even more like a wildcat. Thoroughly disgruntled, Quarter's ears were flattened against her head and her tail flicked back and forth in a dangerous way. Quarter snarled and bared her teeth at anyone who looked at her. If Quarter looked uncomfortable, then right next to her was somebody who looked perfectly at ease. Varian Robinson had taken the opportunity to dress to the nines and was wearing a dark blouse underneath a blazer paired with a matching pencil skirt. Inez had never known Varian to dress so outwardly feminine, or in any way that could be described by a gender for that matter. Varian looked comfortable and seemed to be enjoying themselves. Just before Inez reached the Stormbreakers, Marcus Robinson walked by, leading Pascal Etienne by the hand. Marcus paused and looked at Varian for a moment, then paid his family member a small compliment before moving on with the former UN leader. "So, this is what it takes to make you dress up, huh?" Inez commented, giving them a friendly nudge. "Looking good, Varian." "Thanks," Varian replied, speaking in a voice that was far more effeminate than their normally neutral tone. "My parents and grandparents told me this is going to be a really historic week, and I needed to think about how I want the history books to remember me. So, Varian trailed off. "I'm kinda glad Cassandra's not here," Varian finished. Inez, sensing she was close to a sensitive topic, looked around. Cassandra had wandered away and was introducing herself to a group of Slovakians. The lion-like aliens smiled at one another when Cassandra asked if she could scratch their ears. "Why are you glad she's not here?" Inez asked. "Because she would be able to see through my disguise," Varian replied. "I asked Jericho for help, and she put a psionic illusion around me. Everyone sees me the way I want to be seen, the way I want to see myself." Inez mentally put 2 and 2 together in her head. Then she stepped back and took another look at Varian. For the first time, the full effect of the psionic illusion hit her. She could just barely see the androgynous form of Varian she had come to know, but overlaid on top of that was the image of a woman. If Inez allowed her mind to wander, even for a moment, the illusion was restored to full effect, and Inez was immediately convinced that she was not looking at a genderless person named Varian, but rather a mousy-looking woman called Victoria. "I never imagined Jericho could do something like this," Inez gasped. It's incredible. I've seen what she can do firsthand, Victoria replied. I totally understand why people think she's a god, and why she's afraid of her worshippers. Inez and Victoria turned around to look at Jericho, who was shaking hands with the galactic custodian. Just think. Here in a few days, this will all be over, Inez said. What is Jericho going to do after the war? Heck, what are you and I going to do? Corder snorted. Victoria's grandfather paid the 6 of us a pretty massive fee for our work, she said. As soon as we deal with the paradox, I'm going to buy a small planet in the Somtal Highlands and retire. I'm thinking an arid world with lots of grazing animals. Speak for yourself, Nainu said. Many of my siblings will be laying eggs in a few months. I'm going to buy them premium spots at the best incubator facility on Kelta. I don't know what I'm going to do, Inez confessed, aside from the fact that I'll be living with Cassandra wherever we end up. Victoria grabbed Inez by the shoulder and gave her a little shake. Tell you what, Nezzy, ask your dad and sister if they want to move to Honolulu. We'd love to have you as neighbors, Victoria said. Don't call me Nezzy, Inez replied. And yeah, I'd like that. A few hours later, Cape Canaveral, Florida. The Partogan mothership Mahuika was so massive that her presence above Cape Canaveral could not be ignored. Her 15-kilometer wingspan obscured the UN base from view, hiding it from anyone in orbit. But as the sun started to set on yet another day of the tense military standoff, a shimmering point of light could be seen, approaching from the west. Up above, the Mahuika suddenly began to move, burning her engines hard while launching strike craft from her hangars. Down on the ground, Sophie Murphy, Klaus Eberhard, Inez Vasquez, Rafi Bakir, Polly Spark, Yasin Ackerman, and Sidney Bouclair could hardly believe their eyes. Yasin Ackerman looked very different from this time last year when Sophie had last seen him. Yasin had gotten into a fight recently that left his right hand scarred and bandaged. He also seemed to be walking with a limp. I don't believe it, Commander Eberhard said. She actually got through. Did she use holograms or a cloaking device? Yasin wondered aloud. From here it looks like she used both, Sidney Bouclair said. Impressive. Doubly so, since we know the truth now. While the Mahuika and her escorts burned towards Orlando, a single Partogan frigate flew in the opposite direction. The Partogan warship circled the base for about a minute before coming down to land in a wide patch of grass, the former site of Launch Complex 39B. Only a short distance away, the historic launch tower of Complex 39A cast a long shadow into the Atlantic. Even though powerful and high-ranking people surrounded her, Sophie Murphy avoided talking as the group made its way over to the landing site. She managed to stay true to her word and divulged the location of the Third Hyperspace Core to no one. The only person she spoke with was the only other individual who was close to her age. Inez Vasquez, the ISO armorer, pushed a cart containing a sealed box as she made her way to Pad 39B. Inez, you need help with that? Sophie asked. No, I'm good, Vasquez panted. Besides, highly classified stuff in here you're not supposed to know about. You know how it goes in the ISO. Knowledge is the most powerful thing in the universe. Get you killed or save your life, or whatever the director's old saying is supposed to be. Did you come over with Bouclair? No, I came alone, Sophie said. I only met the rest of the team a few times. You're in good company, Vasquez said. I didn't get a lot of face time with the group either. Just follow whatever plan the director comes up with, and you'll be fine. The Vengeance had dropped her holographic disguise as soon as she landed. While she descended the boarding ramp, Director Scarlett Freeman was talking to a Navy officer. They've probably figured out the ruse by now, but they won't dare open fire on us. Not now that they know we've got hostages. Go get a search team and scan every inch of this vessel. Don't come back until you find that coward Sepulveda. The officer saluted and then turned around to carry out Scarlett's orders. Then Scarlett arrived in the group of her allies. But things were different now. The truth was out. "Director Freeman," Commander Eberhardt said. "Or should we call you something different?" "That depends," replied the woman who called herself Scarlett Freeman. "Are we all on the same side? Human supremacy at all costs? Restoration of the gift? Liberation of Earth from alien influence?" Sophie, Klaus, Yasin, Vasquez, Sydney, Rafi, and Polly all nodded. "You're in good company, Akira," said Rafi. "You don't need to hide from us." And in that moment, the psionic illusion broke. Akira's allies could see her for who she truly was. The paradox looked each of her allies in the face as though reading their minds, which she was almost certainly doing. "I know the situation. It's grim," Akira said. "Robinson and Ranginui outmaneuvered us. I think Robinson had this one in the works for a couple of years. Earth is lost and there's nothing we can do for now. Bouclair, are you ready for the trip to Denem?" "Almost," Sidney Bouclair replied. "We are fueling the Stellaris, Confucius, and Zoroaster right now. Cargo is being loaded, and the live subjects have been moved to the Apollo Center." "How many live subjects?" Akira asked. 247, Polly Spark replied. "About 30 are combat ready. They can plug the holes in the line while we escape." "Holes in the line?" Akira repeated. "What holes?" "Our security contractors," Yasin cut in. "All of the men from Shrike have deserted their posts." "The mercenaries abandoned us when news of Alpha Centauri reached Earth," Sydney explained. "They pointed at the images of those robotic starships and said something about what we've been preparing for and the time has come." "Shrike has gone dark all over the galaxy," Yasin finished. "Their mercenaries have all broken contracts and are fleeing somewhere. We don't know much, but I do have intel that their leaders and commanders have hunkered down inside of an underground base near Las Vegas." "How much of our security team was made up of Shrike?" Akira asked, scratching her chin in thought. "About 90%, Rafi Bakir said. "That leaves just 200 space rangers from my unit to guard the base." "Ma'am, Cape Canaveral is almost 5 square kilometers, not to mention the vast area around the old Kennedy Space Center. Right now, as a space ranger, I can promise you that we cannot secure this area with just 200 men. It's just too big. The enemy can simply go around my men and overrun the base." Akira looked concerned. "The GDF could kill us all while we're trying to take off." Akira folded her arms in thought. Throughout this whole conversation, Sophie had been slowly making her way towards Scarlett. She had her own mission that she needed to complete. "Excuse me?" Sophie said in a meek voice. "There's something I need to tell you." Akira looked over at her. Now that Sophie could see Akira's true face, she could see that, alternate timelines aside, Sophie and Akira really were blood relatives. There was a little bit of Chihiro Tachibana in Sophie and, well, her aunt. "Did you do it?" Akira asked. "Is the hyperspace core safe?" Sophie nodded, and then she started to say the coordinates out loud, but Akira stopped her. "I can read minds, Sophie. I plucked the numbers out of your head a minute ago. You've done very well, and I'm proud of you." Blushing and smiling, Sophie stepped backwards into the group, where Akira's allies welcomed her with warm words and high fives. Akira looked as though she'd made up her mind. Alright, it's time to be adaptable, Akira said. Spark, I'm just going to assume Nezzy blasted my identity over the whole damn galaxy. Liquidate anyone in the base who had a change of heart because of me. Oh, is that what you were doing on the Vengeance? Polly said. We were wondering why it took you so long to get back here. Beauclair, Eberhard, you two coordinate the evacuations. I want the cruisers ready to fly as soon as possible. When can we take off for Deneb? Akira asked. Give us 36 hours, Commander Eberhard said. We'll be ready. Bakir, Ackerman, we need to hold off the GDF for 36 hours, Akira said. I have a surprise of our own we can deploy, but I want you to put 500 troops on the defensive perimeter. Conscript any starship crews or base personnel you want, just so long as all of the holes are plugged. Do not use any of the test subjects. We need them for when we come back to Earth. Then Akira addressed the whole group. 36 hours, people. I want this base empty by the day after tomorrow. Sophie was assigned to conscription duty. She ran from one building to the next, pointing at any men who looked like they were strong enough to hold a rifle and saying, Rafi Bakir wants to see you at the armory. The whole base was active while she did this. The evacuation was now in full swing as base staff worked to dismantle the Prometheus engine and relocate it to the nearby cruisers. Vans and buses, each one loaded with alien children, moved between the Pediatric Center and the Apollo building, where the abductees would be temporarily housed until the time came for the final escape. Sophie ran into the vehicle assembly building, grabbing men and pulling them away from their work with orders to report to the armory. Then, just before midnight, Sophie and the others were summoned to meet with Akira one last time. 526 feet above the ground, Sophie and her allies opened the access door and stepped onto the roof of the vehicle assembly building. From here, they had a commanding view of the surrounding base and ocean. Working together, Vasquez, Rafi, Yasin, and Eberhard all managed to get Vasquez's heavy case out of the stairwell and onto the roof. Akira looked up at the Mahuika, disgusted. By the time the GDF recovers from this, we'll be long gone, Sydney commented. They won't recover at all, Akira said. Haven't you been watching the news? The new Secretary General is here. He's in Orlando, making peace with the Galactic Custodian. And she's there too. Akira smiled at the western horizon. There was a magnificent orange glow marking the location of Orlando. Behind her, Vasquez opened the case to reveal its contents. It was a newer version of the Prometheus device stolen from the Apollo Center by Piper Russell a few months ago. With help from Vasquez, Akira donned the metal backpack and activated the miniature Alarium reactor contained inside of it. Then she ran a series of cables from the generator to a pair of metal cuffs, one on each of Akira's wrists. Robinson, Ranji Nui, the Stormbreakers, Akira said. Everyone is in Orlando tonight. The American leaders begging for a seat at the table. Every UN commander who was too weak to join us. General McCavity and his staff, Irabik and her new robot friends. Every conceivable threat to our species. Everyone who could ever hold humanity back is right there in Orlando. Polly spat over the side of the building, showing her disdain. Akira activated her Prometheus device. Holographic emitters flickered to life and turned themselves onto Akira. Her skin, hair, and outfit all began to change as the illusion came together. They think they've won! Akira jeered. They think they've got the best of us. That humankind will go back to the days of exploitation and subservience, back to their so-called galactic community. And once they don't have a common enemy anymore, they'll just go right back to their petty squabbles and fight each other all over again. Their peace will be temporary and forgotten just as quickly. The holographic illusion was coming together. Akira was transforming into a beautiful woman with white hair and blue eyes, dressed in pearly white robes underneath a shining golden corset, while a cape billowed out behind her. "And Jericho is there too," Akira said. "I remember when she went to the Galactic Council during the war. She was asked if she would ever become a psionic god emperor, and she refused. Jericho had the power to bring peace, true, lasting peace. All she had to do was enforce order, and she could not do it. Now, we are going to rectify that." Akira raised one arm to the sky, pointing at the Mahuika above her. With this gift of psionics, Jericho could have forced an end to all conflict and strife. Jericho could have forced peace on those who refused it. All of the galaxy was already united behind her. She could have done it. But since she won't, I will become the Jericho that can. Jericho will rise from the flames of hell and look down on a tortured galaxy, calling out for someone to save it from itself. Sophie cheered. "You are the true Jericho," Sophie yelled. "You are real, and that bitch who betrayed her people is the fake." "Yes," Rafi chimed in. "We have the true Jericho on our side. That's all we need." Psionic energy began to swirl around the rooftop. Arcs of green light snapped and popped through the air like lightning bolts. Sophie's hair was caught up as though in a wind. "When we return," Akira declared, her voice booming out across the cape, "and we will return. We will expel Robinson and his ilk from the planet. We will fight like the Reapers and Templars of the last war with a fury none will be able to resist. We will retake what is ours, and if the alien menace tries to subjugate us again, we will fight. Like William Carter fought in 1962, like Dwayne Gardner in 2036. We'll defend our world from the Xeno menace. We will fight on our soil, fight in the heavens. We will fight in the asteroid belts and the hyperlanes and in the nebulas. We will fight with growing confidence and strength among the stars." A point of green light appeared in the thin air just above Akira's hand. She pointed her palm upwards towards the Mahuika. "We are humans! We will be superior, and we will never surrender again!" Akira cried out, and then pulled her arm back. A tiny sphere of darkness appeared in the air above Akira. Despite its small size, it pulled everything in the area inexorably toward itself, like a minuscule black hole. With a great push, Akira sent the singularity flying into the heavens above, where it collided with the Mahuika. The effect was instantaneous. The Partogan warship was pulverized as the microscopic singularity tore through its hull and embedded itself somewhere deep within the ship. Mahuika's armor buckled as the singularity began to implode the vessel from the inside. The sound it made was horrifying, like a freight train barreling headlong into a tornado. With a great noise, explosions started to erupt along the Mahuika's hull. The warship was coming apart at the seams, looking less and less like herself with each passing moment. Crumpling up, the dorsal and ventral sides of the starship collapsed onto themselves, while the wingtips detached and fell several miles to the ground below. "And now," Akira cried out, "a parting gift for the traitors!" Akira brought her arm down and pointed her palm towards Orlando. With a nightmare-inducing sound, the Mahuika began to move. The wrecked mothership was being pulled along by the singularity, tearing apart her insides. In seconds, the minuscule point of oblivion was moving too fast, and it tore out of the mothership to fly along its deadly path. At once, Mahuika exploded. rent apart in a cloud of fire and debris. The shattered remains of the mothership flew across the sky in pursuit of Akira's dark power. The fireball of Mahuika's demise was nothing compared to what happened next. Akira's singularity, surrounded by the swirling wreckage of the Partogan warship, pulled other GDF starships into its wake. Frigates, destroyers, and carriers were all pulled to pieces. Armored vehicles on the ground were thrown into the skies, while the immense forces shredded soldiers limb from limb. A trail of destruction followed the singularity across the Floridian Peninsula, but soon it passed out of Akira's range. Her power could no longer sustain it. As the now shattered city of Titusville was left behind, the singularity, enveloped in a cloud of debris, began to shrink and lose power. Standing on the roof of the VAB, Akira fell to her knees, utterly exhausted. Panting, she sat up with the help of her allies. Sophie, Akira, Eberhard, Yasin, Vasquez, Sydney, Ruffy, and Polly all watched as the horrific constellation of metal and wreckage vanished over the horizon. And then they saw it. The distant orange glow on the horizon began to flicker. Akira stood up, bracing herself against Rafi's shoulder. The distant glow seemed to have become brighter, turning almost yellow. And then, white points of light were suddenly visible in the distance. It was the city. Torn up by their foundations, hundreds of thousands of buildings were flying up into the sky, drawn towards the flickering singularity. As they tumbled through the air, high-rises collapsed into glittering clouds of debris. Cars and trucks sailed into the sky, their lights flashing madly in the chaotic scene. Torn off the ground by the sheer force of Akira's power, the city of Orlando and its 15 million inhabitants rose high above the surface of the earth, so far that it could be seen 80 kilometers away. Polly and Sophie screamed out loud and clapped their hands to their mouths. Finally, the last of Akira's power was drained. She slumped backwards, falling to the floor. And as Akira fell, so did Orlando.